The most important training concept is the principle of specificity. The principle of specificity states that the body responds in accordance with the stimuli it receives. Your body adapts to the stress that it's placed under, and the stress dictates the shape, form, and manner of that adaptation. Okay, science guy, break that down. What does that mean? Well, it means that if you want to get better at a thing, you should do that thing. If you want to get better at running, you should run. If you want to get better at swimming, you should swim. If you want to get better at rhythmic gymnastics, do rhythmic gymnastics. And if you want to get bigger and stronger, you should lift. If you want to get better at a thing, do that thing. Okay, so how does specificity apply to bodybuilding? Well, the goal of bodybuilding is to build the body, it's to build muscle. Interestingly, we don't actually understand everything about how the body or why the body builds muscle, but we do understand a few key principles. We know with some certainty that the primary driver of muscle growth, of muscle hypertrophy, is mechanical tension. That means that the body responds to tension, the muscles respond to load, and that load, that tension applied to the fibers and muscles of your body, helps to dictate the shape of the adaptation. This implies two things. That tension must be sufficiently strong, it must be sufficiently heavy, and the muscles themselves must be sufficiently engaged so as to push back against that tension. So in practice, that means that our weights need to be relatively heavy, and then we need to train with some proximity to failure. Generally speaking, research has shown that hypertrophic outcomes are equal if you train anywhere between 5 and 30 reps, as long as those sets are taken close to failure. Moving on, we know that the amount of work you do matters. Doing one set of bicep curls will probably do something, but doing more will probably do more. The workload you do will send a stronger signal to your body, and that in turn will potentially engender greater progress. We also know that it matters how often you do that work. So if you only do one set of biceps once a month versus one set of biceps once a day, you'll have very different results. Lastly, particularly in the realm of bodybuilding, variation matters. We need to try a number of movements. We need to build all the muscles of our body, so this requires variety. We also might need a variety of training stimuli because there are different types of muscle fibers, and we want to make sure we expose all of them to the necessary amount of stress to induce progress. So now we actually have a framework. We know that specificity is the most important thing, but there are 4 key training variables. They are intensity, volume, frequency, and variation. I'm going to talk through those variables, and then I'm going to review 3 different programs with you just to show you how the principle of specificity and these 4 variables play out in real life. First, let's begin with intensity. Intensity is defined as a percentage of your 1 rep maximum strength. It's not about how hard you're working, how sweaty you're getting, and how much swearing you're doing in the gym. It's about the percentage of your 1 rep maximum. So if you can bench 200 pounds for 1 rep, that's your max. If you're performing at 90% intensity, that would be 180 pounds. So if you're doing a set of 180 pounds on bench, that is very intense. That's quite close to your maximum capabilities. The concept of proximity to failure is closely tied to this notion of intensity. So for example, if you're performing your 1 rep max, that means that by definition, as soon as you unrack the bar, you are quite close to failure. You can only do 1 rep. That's almost there, right? Like you could fail at any moment. So what that means by proxy is that definitionally, as you get heavier, you are also getting closer to failure in your training. Secondly, let's move on to volume. Volume refers to the amount of work you're doing. It's typically expressed as the number of sets you're doing or the number of hard sets, i.e. those sets that are relatively close to failure. Some people conceptualize volume as sets times reps times weight, but I don't think that's really useful. That's mostly just math for math's sake. I personally like to conceptualize volume as the strength of the signal I'm sending my body. Each additional set is an amplification of that initial signal. And it's important we focus on the word amplification. It's not a new signal. So if the work you're performing is primarily geared towards strength, doing more sets will potentially add more strength. If the work you're doing is geared more towards endurance, doing more work or more volume will just increase those endurance capabilities. It's not going to add a new adaptation. Now, of course, there are limits to this, right? The body is subject to the law of diminishing returns. So generally speaking, each set beyond the first, each application of stimulus beyond the first is going to be less effective. And of course, there's a fatigue cost. The more work you do, the more recovery you'll also need to do to return to baseline after performing that work. So you can't just do an infinite amount of volume and expect an infinite amount of gains. There are diminishing returns both because your body's response will become less robust and because you're adding fatigue over time. Thirdly, we have the variable of frequency, which refers to how often you are exposing your body to a specific stimulus. It's important we focus on the word stimulus here, because stimulus is all-encompassing. For example, training your biceps 3 times a week doesn't necessarily mean that you're just doing the same exercise 3 times a week. It might mean that you're just performing bicep exercises 3 times a week, because different exercises can still impart similar or even the same stimulus. Lastly, we have the variable of variation, which refers to the amount of variety within your training program. This encompasses things like exercise selection and rep range. All of these variables must be balanced against each other. This is the real art of training and programming. You cannot maximize all variables at once for a sustained period of time. It's impossible. You'll break your body. If you train at maximum intensity with maximum frequency and maximum volume, your training will be unsustainable and you won't be able to do it for a long period of time. If you're into math, you can actually assign point values to these variables. So high would be 3, medium would be 2, 1 would be low. If you summate the training variables of intensity, volume, and frequency, you'll generally find that the best programs lie somewhere between 5 and 7 points. Variation in this framework is actually kind of a wild card because it can help you tolerate programs that would otherwise be unsustainable. And I'm actually going to demonstrate that in the first program I review now. The first program I want to look at is Smolov Jr. for bench. Smolov Jr. actually comes from a Soviet squat program, the Smolov program, which is known for being incredibly challenging and breaking people. But for people who survive the Smolov program, they tend to put a ton of weight on their squat in a short period of time. The Smolov Jr. program is just for bench. It's typically thought of as a more strength-oriented program, but bodybuilders absolutely do run it. Now, if you look at this, you'll notice a couple things. The relative intensity here is quite high. You start at 70%, 75%, 80%, and 85%, and add weight for 3 weeks. That's very intense. The frequency is quite high. You're training 4 times a week, and the volume is super high. Day 1 has 6 sets, then 7 sets, 8, and 10. This is a ton of work in a short period of time. And you'll notice that this program can only be run for 3 weeks. This is the definition of an unsustainable program. If you survive it, you'll make excellent progress, but you can't run it for a long period of time, and not everyone can even do a program like this. Remember how I mentioned that variation is the wild card here? Well, part of the reason why this program is even doable in the first place is because it's a bench-only program. While people perform Smolov Jr., they don't even often train their lower body or their back. They're really just benching, maybe doing some perfunctory work for the other muscles. And as a result, they have more resources left to recover. But again, this is not sustainable in the long run. Next, I want to look at the Texas method. The Texas method is often touted as a great program for late beginners. So these are people who have been in the gym for maybe 6, 12, 18 months. They've gone through a typical training program and they're starting to stall. And so they move on to the Texas method. The Texas method consists of 3 days. The first day is a volume day, a 5x5. The second day is a recovery day, usually 2 or 3 sets of 5 at a much lower level of intensity. And then last is the intensity day, 1 all-out set of 5. So we can see here already that the overall intensity of this program is slightly lower than the Smolov Jr. program. Technically, that 1 set of 5 day typically starts at about 85%, so that's quite intense, but still the overall intensity of this program is a little bit lower than Smolov. More significantly is the volume is much, much, much lower. You're really only doing those 5 hard sets on your volume day and then 1 hard set on your intense day. That's only 6 working sets in a week. That's less than a quarter of the volume on the Smolov Jr. program. So this program is much more sustainable in the long run. Sometimes people can run the Texas method for 6 or 12 months, really depends on their state of advancement. However, what I would actually say, what tends to be the issue with the Texas method is that the volume is actually too low and the intensity is too high. So a lot of trainees will find that they're not actually doing enough work to grow their muscles, and so the roadblock will be size and not strength over time. Lastly, I want to show you a program that I personally run myself. I use it when I'm maintaining. So the goal of this program is actually not to put on muscle, it's to hold muscle, maybe because for personal reasons I don't have enough time or I have other goals. In particular, I run this program when I want to really focus on my cardiovascular endurance and health. This program is structured very simply. There are 2 upper days a week and 1 lower day a week. There's actually an A, B, and a C upper day, and they rotate in that order, A, B, C, A, B, C. And there are 2 lower days, A, B, that alternate week to week. For the upper body days, I just perform 1 set per exercise, but it's a rest pause set. So I perform 1 set, 2 are about near failure, then I rest for about 30 seconds, and then I do an additional set. This lets me get in more work in a short period of time. But the volume is relatively low, as you can see. It's only 1 set per exercise. Exercise variety is quite high. I'm doing a number of different movements and subbing them out, as I mentioned. And I'm progressing week to week by adding whatever load I can and trying to match or add reps. The lower body days, I don't train with rest pause reps, in part because I'm working with bigger, heavier movements like squats and deadlifts, and I don't typically train those movements as close to failure. This program is is great because it's sustainable to run in the long run. It has a lot of variety, so it's fun. The intensity is medium, and I would say the volume is medium to low. But as I believe I've demonstrated, this program isn't ideal for growing. When I'm trying to put on new muscle, I don't train like this. I train with more volume and more frequency because that will help to drive more progress. As I've demonstrated here, the variables of intensity, volume, frequency, and variation are paramount. The principle of specificity must always reign supreme. To get the best gains, to get the most gains, you need to ensure that your training is specific and geared towards your goals. With these lessons, I'm sure you can improve your training and make even more progress.